The morning Elias Croft drove a hand-painted wooden stake into the cracked earth at the far edge of his property on the south side of Dust Creek Road, the three men leaning on the fence outside Darby's Hardware could see it from where they stood. It was late August in Mays County, Oklahoma, the kind of August that had been going on for 11 straight weeks without a drop of rain. The pastures along the county road were the color of old newspaper. The creek that gave the road its name had been a dry scar in the earth since June. Every rancher in a 10-mile stretch had either hauled water in or cut their herd down to what the remaining tanks could carry. The aquifer that fed the shallow wells on the west side of the township was dropping 6 inches a month, and everyone knew it. And there was Elias Croft, 71 years old, bad left knee, white mustache, standing on 40 acres of land that the county assessor had quietly stopped trying to value, driving a stake into the ground like he had just decided where to put a fence post. He was not putting in a fence post. Pete Darby, who had run the hardware store for 22 years and knew the business of most people in the township, shaded his eyes and watched. "What in the world is that old man doing?" he said. It was not quite a question. Roy Lester, who ranched 500 acres north of town and had already sold off 60 head this summer because the water situation gave him no choice, looked over and squinted. "Looks like he's marking something." "He told my wife he was going to dig a well," said Calvin Pruitt, who delivered propane on Tuesdays and knew things about people's properties that most people did not. Out there on that south piece, the bare part. There was a silence of the particular kind that settles over men who have enough experience to know when something is a bad idea without needing to say so out loud. Roy Lester shook his head slowly. "There's no water under that ground," he said. "My grandfather sank 2 test bores on the south side of that road back in the 60s. Both dry. The formation doesn't carry water out there. Never has." Pete Darby watched Elias Croft pull a longer stake from the bed of his old Ford and drive it into the earth 20 feet from the first one. "Somebody ought to tell him." "Somebody did," Calvin Pruitt said. He thanked them and kept going. They watched him work for another few minutes, then went back inside out of the heat. There were more practical things to worry about than an old man's certainty. Elias Croft had come to Mays County 11 years earlier, which made him a relative newcomer by the county's standards, where some families had been on the same ground since statehood. He had bought the 40 acres on Dust Creek Road when it was already considered marginal land, paid less for it than it would have cost to rent decent pasture for a season, and had spent the first 3 years doing things with it that his neighbors watched with the kind of polite skepticism reserved for people from elsewhere who think they understand something about land they have only recently met. He had planted cover crops on ground that hadn't seen anything but bare dirt and goat weed in 20 years. He had built earthen swales along the contour lines of the property to slow rainfall that rarely came and direct it toward low points he had identified with a hand level and a length of garden hose filled with water. He had put in native grasses along the fence lines and a small food forest of drought-tolerant trees along the south boundary that his neighbors had described, in the kindest terms, as an experiment that probably wouldn't amount to much. The trees were 12 feet tall now. The grass had spread. After a rain, the Croft property held its water longer than anything around it, and the soil in the places where the cover crops had been working showed a dark, crumbled quality that was different from the pale, hard-packed ground on either side of his fence. Nobody connected these things to what Elias was doing now because the connection was not obvious if you had not been thinking about it the same way he had. If you have ever been the person in the room who saw something others couldn't see yet and chose to keep working instead of arguing, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. What Elias Croft understood about water and land is the kind of knowledge that sounds simple after the fact and impossible before it. The knowledge had come to him slowly, the way real knowledge usually does, not from a single source but from many, accumulated over years of reading and observation, and the particular attention that a man pays to land he has decided to take seriously. He had grown up in eastern Kansas, watching his father fight the land for 30 years and lose, a little yield each dry year, a little more topsoil in the wind each spring, until the farm was sold for debt. Elias had taken a different direction. He had read everything he could find about why some land held water and some did not, why some wells went dry in a drought while others held. The answers pointed in a consistent direction down, into the ground, into the relationship between what grew on the surface and what moved beneath it. What most people in Mays County understood about water was the part they could see. Rain fell. It ran off or soaked in, it pooled in tanks and filled creeks. What they did not think about was the mechanism by which rain made the journey from the surface into the deep formation that fed the wells. That journey was not automatic. It depended entirely on what the soil surface was doing when the water arrived. Bare, compacted soil shed water. The surface sealed itself under rainfall impact, and the water ran sideways instead of down, out of the county entirely. The aquifer got very little of it. But soil that was covered, with plant roots working through it and earthworm channels opening passages at depth, that soil drank. The water moved down slowly and reached the deep formation where it could be stored for months or years. Elias had been building that kind of soil on his 40 acres for 11 years. The south piece, the bare piece, the piece where he had driven his stakes, was the last section he had been working on. It had been the hardest, the most compacted, the most degraded. He had seeded it 3 times with cover crops and lost 2 of those stands to drought before the third took hold. He had run the swales through it in the second year and watched them fill with silt in the first hard rain, and had gone out and cleared them by hand. The work had been slow and mostly invisible to anyone passing on the road. What was not invisible, to the instruments Elias had been tracking since the spring, was what the water was doing under that ground. He had put in 2 monitoring tubes the previous October, simple perforated PVC pipes driven 6 feet into the ground. He checked them every week with a measuring tape, recording depth to moisture in a notebook beside his coffee cup. What they told him was that moisture depth in the south piece had been rising since February. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would show on any county survey. But rising, week by week, in the slow, steady way that things move when a system has been repaired well enough to start functioning again. He had checked the county groundwater records at the Extension office in Pryor. The regional aquifer under the south side of Dust Creek Road showed declining water tables going back 40 years, which matched what Roy Lester's grandfather had found when he sank his test bores in the 60s. The formation was there. The water in it had gone away, because the land above it had stopped sending water down. Elias believed the land above it had started sending water down again. He did not know if he was right. The only way to know was to dig. He hired a water well driller from Wagoner County named Albert Sims, who came out in the first week of September with a truck-mounted rotary rig and the professional skepticism of a man who had drilled 2,000 wells in eastern Oklahoma and developed a clear sense of which ground held water and which did not. Albert walked the south piece before setting up the rig and looked at the ground and the cover and the swales and said, with the directness that comes from charging by the foot, that he would drill where Elias wanted him to drill, but that his own read of the formation said they were unlikely to find anything productive above 200 feet and probably not at all on the south side of the road. Elias said he understood. He said to go ahead. Pete Darby drove past the morning the rig was set up and called Roy Lester from the store phone. By afternoon, the news had made the rounds. The consensus was sympathetic and certain. The old man was wasting money on ground that had been dry since before he was born. But he was a private person, and there was a kind of dignity in letting a man make his own mistakes on his own land. They drilled for 3 days. Albert Sims called Elias on the evening of the second day and told him they had hit fractured sandstone at 90 feet that showed some moisture, but not enough to be optimistic about. He recommended they continue. Elias said continue. On the 3rd day, at a depth of 114 feet, the drill broke into a zone that Albert Sims had not seen on any survey of that formation and had not expected to find on the south side of Dust Creek Road. He called Elias from the drill site. His voice, when he described what the return water looked like coming up the bore, had a quality in it that was not quite surprise and not quite professional neutrality. It was the sound of a man revising an opinion he had held for a long time. It's producing, he said, 12 gallons a minute at test. Could be more once the formation stabilizes. Elias was quiet for a moment. How deep is the static level? 62 feet, Albert said. That formation shouldn't be at 62 feet on this side of the road. I don't have an explanation for that. Elias thought he had an explanation. He did not offer it on the phone. He said thank you and hung up and sat at the kitchen table with his notebook and his coffee and looked at the moisture readings he had been taking since February, the slow weekly rise that had told him something was building down there, and he felt the particular satisfaction of a man who has been patient for a long time and has finally been shown that the patience was justified. He finished the well in October. 6-inch casing, submersible pump, pressure tank in a small pump house he built himself over a weekend. The water tested clean. 12 gallons a minute was more than the household and garden needed. Considerably more. The drought did not break that fall. It did not break in November or December. It broke in February, partially, with 2 inches of rain that refilled some of the surface tanks and raised some of the shallow wells, but left the regional aquifer still well below where it had been before the dry stretch began. By March, Pete Darby's well at the hardware store on the east side of town was pulling sand, which is what shallow wells do when the water table drops below the intake screen. He had it looked at and was told he needed to either deepen the well or find another source. Deepening it would cost more than he had budgeted for the year. Roy Lester's stock tank on the north pasture had not refilled from the February rain. He was hauling water again by April, the same calculation he had been doing all the previous summer, the same math that didn't improve no matter how many times you ran it. Calvin Pruitt, who knew more about the state of people's water situations than most, began to understand in April that the township was heading into a second dry year with the aquifer already depleted from the first, and that a number of people who had made it through the previous drought on reserve were going to find themselves without that reserve when the heat came. It was Calvin who drove down Dust Creek Road on a Tuesday in late April and stopped at Elias Croft's gate. He had a reason to stop that was not about the well. He had a propane delivery. But he stood at the pump house after making the delivery and looked at the pressure gauge on the tank and at the pipe going into the ground and at the old man who had come out of the house to talk to him. "You got water," Calvin said. It was not a question. The green of the Croft property, visible even from the road, made the answer obvious. "I do," Elias said. "How much?" "More than I need." Calvin Pruitt looked at him for a moment. He was a practical man, not given to indirect conversation. "Pete Darby's well is giving out," he said. "Roy Lester is hauling again. There are 4 or 5 places on the west side that are going to be in real trouble by July if we don't get rain." "I know," Elias said. "How did you find water out here?" Roy's grandfather said this ground was dry. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Walk with me." He walked Calvin Pruitt around the south piece for an hour, explaining the swales and the cover crops and the moisture monitoring tubes and what he had been watching in the numbers since February. He explained it the way he understood it, which was carefully and without claiming more than he knew. He showed Calvin the notebook with the weekly readings. He explained what he believed had happened under the ground when the surface was given the chance to function the way it was supposed to. Calvin listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both practical ones about cost and timeline. Elias answered them honestly, including the parts where the answers were uncertain. Pete Darby came the following week, directly and without preamble, stood at the fence line, and asked Elias the same question Calvin had asked. Elias walked him around the same way and showed him the notebook. Roy Lester came on a Saturday with his son, who managed most of the ranch operation now. They were there for an hour. Roy's son took photographs on his phone and asked about seeding rates and timeline. Elias said 2 to 3 years before you would see the infiltration rates change in a meaningful way. He said starting was more important than starting perfectly. Roy Lester said very little during the visit. He was a man who processed things slowly and acted on them deliberately, which was part of why he had survived ranching in Mays County as long as he had. On his way out, he stopped at the gate and turned back. "I've been running cattle on that north piece for 30 years, he said. "The water situation has never been good. I always figured that was just the nature of the ground up there." "It might be partly that," Elias said, "but probably not all of it." Roy Lester looked at him for a moment. "You think the ground can still change?" "I think it wants to," Elias said. "It just needs to be given the room." The county extension office sent an agent out in June after Calvin mentioned the situation at a township water meeting. The agent walked the property, took soil cores, and said what Elias had described was consistent with documented principles of hydrological restoration. He said he would like to bring a hydrologist from Stillwater. Elias said that was fine. The hydrologist came in July and confirmed what the well had already shown. The moisture recharge under the south piece was occurring at a rate inconsistent with the regional formation data, consistent with significantly improved surface infiltration built over years. She said she had not seen this pattern in this county before. She asked Elias how long he had been working the land this way. 11 years, he said. She was quiet. So this has been building for 11 years, and nobody knew it was there. I knew something was building, Elias said. I didn't know how much until we drilled. That fall, Roy Lester hired a contractor to put in contour swales on the north pasture and seeded 200 acres to native grass mix that Elias helped him select. Pete Darby deepened his well and replanted the vacant lot behind the hardware store with a cover crop blend Elias recommended, partly as an experiment and partly, he said, because he had run out of reasons not to try something different. Elias was not a man who enjoyed being looked at, and he was not a man who had done what he did in order to be right. He had done it because the land was in trouble and he believed the trouble could be addressed, and he had been willing to spend 11 years being uncertain about whether he was correct. He had been correct. The well proved it in the only way that mattered, which was the way that turned the pump on in July when the county road was cracked and dry and the shallow wells were pulling sand, and the water came up clean and cold and kept coming. His grandfather had told him once, when he was young, that the land was not an enemy to be beaten and not a machine to be operated. It was a system and a patient one, and it would respond to patience in kind if you gave it long enough to answer. Elias had given it long enough. The people who had watched him drive that stake into the cracked August ground and shaken their heads were the same people now sitting at his kitchen table asking how long it would take and what it would cost and where to start. He told them the same thing his grandfather had told him. Start with the ground under your feet. Pay attention to where the water goes. Give it somewhere better to go. Then wait. The waiting is the hardest part. But the land remembers everything you put into it. Every seed, every swale, every season you chose to work with it instead of against it. It remembers and eventually it answers. You just have to be the kind of person who is still there when it does.